Tēnā koutou. Nau mai hara mai ki tēnei Wananga bite. So this Wananga bite is specifically about transition forests. What does transition forest look like? What does it do? And how does that appear in a Māori context? The first thing that I like to say is that the word or the context transition forest is an appropriated name. Because most forests are transition forests. They are moving from one thing to another thing over time, albeit in the most part it's over hundreds or thousands of years. In this particular context, we're talking about the transition of exotic in New Zealand into native. Why are we talking about that? In the current climate, there are a lot of opportunities that we as Māori are interested in pursuing, and one of those is our aspirations toward achieving native forest or native afforestation on our lands. And we find it very difficult on our lands for sustainable development, and transition forests are one avenue that we've identified as a really good way that we can transition to native forest and achieve our aspirations for our landowner. The first thing, why would we use transition forests rather than simply planting native into pasture? And the first thing there is about risk. So our native indigenous high forest species, their natural ecology requires a nurse crop. They're also very shade tolerant, and they don't like a lot of light on them to get started. They need shelter, they need protection. They don't like frost, and they don't like wide open spaces. That is, again, not their natural ecology. So that includes things like our native high forest species like podocarps, matai, miro, tōtara, rimu, those types of trees, kauri. But most other native softwood tree species also need nurse crops. In nature, for our indigenous species, the nurse crop is normally provided by manuka or kanuka. In a transition forest, we're looking to replace the manuka kanuka with an exotic, in the most part being radiata. Therefore, we de-risk the succession of a native high forest establishment by providing a surrogate nurse crop, and we reduce the risks associated with establishment. Why use exotic? Why not use manuka or kanuka? The simple answer is it works, and we can use carbon financing to pay for this evolution. There are those who would say that transition forest doesn't work, that it is unproven, that it isn't evidence-based. To those people, I simply say, do your homework. Scion has recently produced 2 substantive bodies of work that unequivocally reference transition forests as a viable option. So Scion is the New Zealand forestry research institution for New Zealand. So if they're saying it, I'm not sure why someone else might dispute that. There's also been a body of work published evidence review commissioned by Tūrurako, which is on their website, which also categorically says that transition forests are a viable option. Tūrurako's website also has guidance on how to do a transition forest on their website. And I guess in closing on that space, if you asked the European forestry community, they might call it not transition forest, they might call it close to nature forestry or freestyle silviculture, but it's the same thing. They have been transitioning from their exotic, being spruce, their cash tree crop similar to New Zealand's radiata, to indigenous, in the same way in which pine will transition to native, and they've been doing it since the 1900s. So if we needed another good example of how it does work, then we have a European example. So transition forest works, it works practically. And the other bit that's really important, particularly for our Māori landowners, is that we can use carbon financing to get there. So what does carbon financing look like? So firstly, carbon financing, direct native establishment is simply not financially feasible. We're talking about establishment costs of anywhere, 15 to 18,000 per hectare. That's just the year one. And then there are all these ongoing costs that go with it, and it's very risky planting our native into pasture. So when the carbon price hits somewhere around the $200 a unit mark, at that point we might be able to do direct establishment and be able to pay for it. It'll still be risky, but at least we'll be able to pay for it. But in the current environment, a transition from an exotic to a native is more financially viable. And we use fast-growing exotics to store carbon that then provide the carbon units, which we can use to fund both the exotic establishment and the ongoing native transition. I'm not going to go into the economics. There was recently a webinar by a chap who talked about transition and how it's not economically viable. It was a really good presentation, and unfortunately I'm going to have to refute that because he did a very good job of explaining how the cost curves all work, and then he just simply said, and it won't work for transition forests, and then gave no reasons for that. So I'll do that in our next Wananga Bite. So what does a transition forest look like in a Māori context? So this is where the magic happens. A lot of our Māori landowners simply desire the return of their whenua to native, as it was, say, 100, 200, 300 years ago. There is infinite rationale for that. I suggest it is the mauri of our whenua calling to us, letting us know that that's what it would like to have happen to it, that it gets reverted back to its native state. But that's only my story. I personally love the option, and I lament the word option, that transition forest offers us, and that carbon financing provides the opportunity to do this. Others simply want to do native for their own reason. At the end of the day, the why is for our Māori landowners to decide. It's not for us to tell them what they must do on their whenua. Transition forestry is simply a way of de-risking and financing this ultimate outcome, which must align with our Māori landowners' aspirations. The time frame is defined by the landowner and influenced by their unique conditions. And the great thing about transition forests is it's infinitely customizable. It must be matched with the aspirations of the landowner and coupled with their capability. But ongoingly, it can be changed to suit the needs at any time. A generic example that I'm going to use is a landowner that we have up north. They have aspirations of native forests, but they have no money and no capability to do so. The block is just over 40 hectares. They also aspire to have their whānau reconnect with their land, so they're pretty keen on doing the groundwork themselves. Therefore, some ongoing costs may not be quite as big a concern for them as it might be for others. We have secured a financing partner who will help them establish their exotic forests, and they'll exit that agreement somewhere between year 15 and year 20. At that point, the trust will have standing pine. They'll have finished their establishment phase and their initial silviculture, and they're ready to go for a transition. At a carbon price of $50, it's currently $70. They will also have an excess of $10,000 per hectare with which to transition and pay for any of that ongoing work. They wish to transition in 100 years, and they've agreed to do a 2-year work program so that their whānau can do their work over Christmas and things like that. So, detail. From the age of, say, 25, conservatively, they'll start systematically creating light wells to the tune of 10 by 10 metre sort of size. And they'll do roughly about 16 of those light wells on an ongoing 2-year basis, meaning they will have completed full transition to native within 50 years or at age 75. Why are they doing 16 of these 10 by 10? That's simply because the math. That equals 1.6 hectares. They're doing 1.6 hectares every 2 years, which means they do 40 hectares across 50 years. Our generic recommendation is that the landowners do somewhere between 5 and 10%, and that they do that every 5 years, meaning that transition happens between 50 and 100 years. What's a light well? A light well is simply a clearing in the middle of the forest that allows the understory to grow. In a perfect world, this light well would then be populated by animals and birds with the seeds to grow the forest understory up, and those high forest species come through now that a light well has been created for them to grow into. But if this doesn't happen, this allows the opportunity for the whānau to do what's called enrichment planting, whereby they will go and get native seedlings and put those seedlings into those light wells. And by using that, they can also modify what the future look of the forest might be. It might have originally been a tōtara forest, a couple of 100 years ago, but they might like it to be more of a mixed podocarp forest, so they might insert more rimu or matai or miro or kauri into that mix to get that coming through as well. Every 2 years, the operation will also need to look at doing some releasing or weeding or selecting the tree species that are coming through these light wells. So that means just taking out the understory that they don't want and releasing the trees and the units that they do want to grow. The expectation is that every light well would need to be visited 3 times or across a 6-year time frame. The first one is to create the light well itself. That's to ring bark and create the light well. The second visit would be to thin and release or do some enrichment planting as necessary. And the third one would be to replicate that thin release and maybe do some enrichment planting. After that, wouldn't need to be done. So at any time, we're talking about modifying just under 10% of the forest, or 4 hectares every 2nd year. So not a onerous operation for the whānau. The beauty of transition forest is they could go faster if they deemed appropriate, or if they wanted to move a bit faster, or they could slow down. There's no problem. We're talking about a forest that's going to be there for hundreds of years. So an extra decade or 2 on an intergenerational scale is simply not a problem. To be clear, transition from manuka or kanuka as a nurse crop is absolutely doable in a similar fashion. Direct planting is also doable. Unfortunately, neither of those options are just economically feasible with today's current legislative settings, and the latter, that is direct planting into pasture, is very risky in terms of crop failure, noting that financing is only available, or carbon financing is only available on ETS eligible land. Some other disclosures for this Wananga bite: pest control. That may or may not be necessary. It is not a given that it is a must, despite what the conservationists say. Exotic nurse crops are generally not palatable to pests. Stock tends to damage it, but they're generally not palatable to pests. But as this transitions into native, pest control may be necessary, and it certainly be a preferable part of management, but it's not necessarily critical. Some would probably start talking about wildfire and wildfire issues. In response to that, and in all simplicity, all forests are subject to fire risk. The main risk is people, albeit most fires, or 70% of all fires, are caused outside of the forest, not within the forest, by people outside the forest. The point is, Aotearoa needs more forests, and forests will be subject to wildfire more than pasture. This is, whether that's indigenous or not, this is simply a fact. Some will talk about wilding and say that that's a problem. Well, if that's a problem for that particular location, then there are exotic species that can be utilised which are much lower risk. For example, attenuata. There are also some options that are actually sterile. Now, they are a little bit more expensive to establish, and their growth rates tend to be a little lower than our exotics radiata. But again, if that is a problem, then it's absolutely doable. I also expect some to question carbon financing, but as mentioned before, I'll do that as another Wananga bite, as our next Wananga bite. So in summary, transition forestry or transition forests provide a viable and scientifically sponsored, proven method of achieving native high forest, but with the benefit of being financially feasible, financially viable. For Māori, this is even better in that it's an intergenerational approach to transitioning our land back into native. It is financed, and we can make some money out of it, and the plan is infinitely modifiable as conditions change over the intergenerational planning horizon. So tērā taku kōrero mo tēnei rā, e pāna ki te kaupapa transition forest, ka nui te mihi kia koutou. Kia ora rā.